In this podcast, I'm going to go over persistent accents. Hopefully by now you've all read Unit 2 of Master Narde's Attic Greek Introduction, and there he gives you a detailed discussion of accents. Now it can be a bit overwhelming, and so what I've decided to do here is to pull out the most important things you need to know and help you streamline your learning of the accents for nouns and adjectives. And these are the persistent accents. I'll have another podcast on enclitics and then another podcast on recessive accents. But for now, we're going to be concerned with persistent accents. Now, as Master Narde showed you, Greek accents can only go on the last three syllables. And these syllables, we refer to them as ultima, penultima, and antepenult. And we're going to be using these letters U for ultima, P for penultima, and A for antepenult. Now there are three kinds of accents. Acute, and this can go on a long or a short vowel. Circumflex, which can only go on long vowels. And grave, which can go on long or short vowels, but only on the final syllable. So that means, of course, you need to have under your belt control over which vowels in Greek are long and which ones are short. And so here, circled in yellow are the ones that are always short. So epsilon and omicron are always short. Circled in blue are the ones that are always long. Eta and omega are always long. And then the ones that aren't circled are the ones that can be either long or short. Alpha, iota, and upsilon. And it's these three that tend to cause a little bit of trouble, especially when it comes to accentuation, because it's not always obvious if it's the long or the short of these vowels. But one tip is that if your vowel is accented with a circumflex, then you know it is long. Also long are diphthongs, most of the time. So here I've highlighted the two that are a little tricky, the alpha iota I and the omicron iota oi are, for the purposes of accentuation, short. But in general, the other diphthongs are long. Okay, let's move on now to see where the positions that accents can be, to give you a more visual sense. So here I've produced a spread with the antepenult, penult, and ultima, and I put in the accents where you can see where they possibly can go. So you have the acute can go in all three, the circumflex only on the penult and ultima, and the grave only on the ultima. Now I've circled the grave and the acute to point out that really the grave is, for the most part, just an effect that happens on the acute in the ultima position when a word is following, unless, of course, that word is an enclitic, and we'll deal with that when we talk about enclitics later. So for our purposes here, in terms of learning the persistent accents, it's just better to ignore the grave for now. So now let's look at some of the basic rules. Now, of course, Master Narde gave you all of the rules, which again can be overwhelming, and he admits that in his introduction. So what I've done is I've picked out some of them that, if you bear these in mind, these three in mind, you can sort of more streamline and efficiently gain control of the persistent accents. So The basic rules, there are going to be three that I'm going to focus on. Number one is that persistent accents want to stay where they are in the nominative, hence the name persistent. So they want to stay where they are in the nominative. Okay, the next one is that a long ultima may cause an accent to change. It'll either cause it to move toward the ultima, or it might cause it to change shape from circumflex to acute. Okay? And then the third rule is that the genitive plural of alpha eta declension always has a circumflex on the ultima. And this is something to bear in mind because it's going to have an effect on a lot of the patterns that we're going to look at. Okay, so my first tip then for you is to, as you're creating your vocabulary lists, I suggest that you group your nouns according to where the accent falls. So, in addition to putting in the nominative, the genitive, the gender, and meaning, you can group your nouns and adjectives by where the accent falls. So here I have a card. Your card doesn't necessarily have to look like this, but the information should be there, where you have nouns that have the acute on the ultima. Here's another card where the nouns have the acute on the antepenult. Now, you might think about buying something like this if you wanted and color coding your cards according to where the accent falls. Now, the reason why I'm suggesting this is because there is actually a pattern. And you can already start to see the pattern as you do this exercise of putting your nouns according to their accents. So here, for example, with this list of acute on ultima, we can see that the acute on the nominative ultima becomes a circumflex on the genitive ultima. So adelphos becomes adelphou. Likewise, theos becomes theou, and strategos becomes strategou. And then if you were to look at your list of acute on the antepenult, a similar pattern occurs. You'll notice that the acute on the antepenult has moved to the acute on penult. So angelos becomes angelou. Anemos becomes amenu, anemu. Anthropos becomes anthropou. So one more time, I do think that it's important to try to group your words according to their accents, even if you don't go ahead and get a color-coded flashcard system. Nonetheless, you want to start to do this, and here is why. Because indeed, that initial intuition that there is a pattern actually bears out to be true. And so that's what we're going to actually go through in this podcast. I'm going to show you the patterns and encourage you to learn your nouns and adjectives according to their accent patterns. Okay, so let's look at the first accent pattern, which refers to nouns or adjectives that have acute accent on the ultima. And here you can use the article, especially the neuter article, as the model for the pattern because it has acute accent on the ultima and it follows a specific pattern. Notice, in the nominative it's acute, genitive circumflex, dative circumflex, accusative it's acute, the nominative plural it's acute, the genitive it's a circumflex, dative plural it's a circumflex, and accusative plural it's an acute. So the pattern then is acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. This pattern holds true then for nouns that have the acute accent on the ultima in the omicron and eta alpha declension. So let us look at an example. Potamos, masculine noun in the omicron declension, and lo and behold, it has the pattern. The nominative has an acute, nominative singular has an acute, the genitive singular has a circumflex, dative singular circumflex, accusative singular acute. The plural, nominative acute, genitive circumflex, dative circumflex, accusative plural acute. So it has the same pattern as the article, the neuter article. All right, let's look at a feminine noun that is in the omicron declension, chodos. And lo and behold, the same pattern holds true. So we have acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. What about a feminine noun? Here we can see the pattern is also the case in an alpha, eta declension feminine noun. So it's acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. In the plural, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. An eta noun in this declension rule applies as well. Pattern applies as well. Acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. What about a masculine noun in the alpha eta declension? Same pattern. Dicastes has an acute in the nominative, circumflexes in the dative singular, dative plural, genitive plural, and has acute in the accusative singular, nominative plural, the genitive and dative plural have circumflexes, and the accusative plural has an acute. So pattern number one, if a word has an acute on the ultima, it will have the same accent pattern as the neuter article, which is in the singular, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute, and in the plural, acute, circumflex, circumflex, acute. Pattern number two, which is the accent, acute accent on the penult. Okay, now in this, the rule is that the accent tends to stay the same most of the time. The exceptions are when rule number 3 kicks in and the eta alpha declension in the genitive plural, which requires a circumflex over the last syllable. All right, so let us look at feminine noun in the omicron declension, nosos, and notice the accent is an acute in all cases. A neuter noun in the omicron declension, biblion, and again, the accent is the same in all the cases. The feminine eta alpha declension, doxa, has the exception. In the genitive plural, instead of having the acute on the penult, it has a circumflex on the ultima because of that number 3 rule that all eta alpha declension in the genitive plural have this circumflex on the ultima. So, pattern number 2. An acute accent on the penult will stay the same most of the time, the exception being the genitive plural of eta alpha declension, which always takes a circumflex over the last syllable. Pattern number 3. Circumflex on the penult. And again, the main exception will be caused by rule number 3, the genitive plural of eta alpha declension, always taking a circumflex over that last syllable. But circumflex are a little more complicated than acute, so it's worth thinking about some additional rules for them. There's what we call the long-short rule that requires that for a circumflex to sit on a penult, the ultima must be short. So what that does is that when the case ending becomes long, it will affect the circumflex. And how it affects the circumflex is that it changes it from a circumflex to an acute. And in this pattern, the gender in the omicron declension nouns becomes relevant because the masculine and neuter tend to have different endings in the nominative and accusative. Okay, so let's look at the neuter, which is the easiest one. So we can see that it has a circumflex on the penult, and then in the genitive and dative singular, we have an acute because that ending is long. Then we have a circumflex on the nominative and accusative. Nominative plural, we have a circumflex because that ending is short. In the genitive and dative, again, we have the acute because the endings are long. And in the neuter plural accusative, we have the circumflex. And this actually turns out to be, pattern-wise, the inverse of the neuter article, which you remember had an acute circumflex, circumflex acute in the singular and plural. Well, this has the opposite, which is circumflex acute, acute circumflex in the singular and plural. All right. So that's pattern 3A, referring to the neuters in the omicron declension. And in the plural, except for that accusative plural, which is acute. Eta, alpha, or alpha eta declensions. Now review again this long-short rules because again, remember our issue was with alphas, we don't know sometimes whether it's long or short. So here is a grid that shows the cases when alphas are long and alphas are short. And what we find out is that most of the time alphas are long. So that's good. So it means that it's best to focus on when alphas are short. So alphas can be short in the nominative and accusative and in the nominative plural. Okay. So this, of course, is going to affect how these things work. All right, so we'll look at glotta, which is a feminine noun in the alpha eta declension with that short alpha. So we get a circumflex, acute, acute, circumflex, and then we get a circumflex because that nominative plural is short. But in the genitive plural, we get our rule number 3 kicking in, so it's going to have the circumflex on the ultima. And then we have an acute and then another acute. Because just like the masculine, the feminine or eta alpha declension has a long accusative plural. All right, so pattern number 3 then, the eta alpha, alpha eta declension with circumflex on the penult has the same pattern as the omicron declension masculines, except in the genitive plural where, of course, rule number 3 kicks in, which requires that genitive plural in eta alpha or alpha eta declension to be circumflex on the ultima. All right, pattern number 4. This can only apply to acutes and acute accent on the antepenult. And again, the main exception is going to be caused by rule number 3, genitive plurals of eta alpha declensions always have a circumflex over that last syllable. All right, so let's start with the neuters again, since they tend to be okay. And what we find is that the acute stays where it is when the ending is short, but moves to the penult when the ending is long. So the pattern then would be acute on the antepenult, then in the genitive and the dative, acute on the penult, and in the accusative, it's acute on the antepenult again. So, pattern 4A, omicron declension neuters with an acute on the antepenult. The accent moves to the penult if the ending is long. And in general, this is the rule. Okay, let's look at the masculine now. And sure enough, the same pattern applies, except in that genitive, that accusative plural, where that ending is long. And so instead of having an acute on the antepenult, as we would in the neuter, we have an acute on the penult. And so rule 3b, it's acute on the antepenult. The accent moves if the penult is long. All right, and what about the eta alpha declension? If the acute accent is on the antepenult, it will move if the ultima is long. It'll move to the penult. And so we can tell also with this that ultima alpha is short, because you can't get the accent so far back if the ultima was long. So that's a tip for figuring out whether or not you're dealing with a long alpha or a short alpha. Okay, and so what we can see then is that long ending in the genitive and the dative singular, and in the dative plural and accusative plural, pulls the accent to the penult. And the exception is, of course, the genitive plural, which gets the circumflex on the ultima because of rule number 3. And so pattern 4C then is that the acute on the antepenult will be pulled to the penult if the ultima is long, except in the genitive plural, where rule number 3 kicks in. And so to summarize the patterns, pattern 1, if the word has an acute on the ultima, it will have the same pattern as the neuter article. Pattern 2, an acute on a penult will stay the same most of the time, the exception being rule number 3, which requires that the genitive plural of an eta alpha declension must take a circumflex on the ultima. Pattern 3A for neuter omicron declension, they have the inverse pattern of the neuter article. 3B has basically the same pattern as the neuter, except in the plural accusative, which is long, and so it'll take an acute instead of a circumflex. 3C for the eta alpha declension, again, it pretty much follows the same pattern as the masculine in the omicron declension, except of course the genitive plural, where you're going to get that circumflex on the ultima. 4A, acute on antepenult. For neuters, the accent will be pulled to the penult if the case ending is long. And so we see an alternation pattern where the nominative and accusative will always have an acute on the antepenult, whereas the genitive and the dative will always have an acute on the penult. In the masculine, basically the same as the neuter, except again in that accusative plural, which is long, and so you'll have an acute on the penult there. And the last one being the eta alpha declension for C, same pattern as the masculine, except, of course, for the ultima. For the ultima of the third of the genitive plural, which will take a circumflex.